Okay, I'm going to acknowledge I don't like that I'm just looking at me and that I don't have slides, so I'm probably going to make this really, really, really quick. So this is supposed to be standard for part two, where I answer your questions that you guys did that day in class. Um, I also realized when I was, well, at some point earlier today, that I probably should have looked at a calendar when I was making my grand plan and sending it to you guys yesterday, because I actually shorted us a week in the semester, so I may not have to do a recording of 7 and 8, but we're going to wait and see how next week goes. I already have a feeling it's going to be kind of nuts. But anyway, so this is just to answer, sort of do the Q&A for standard 4. So let's see what we got. So what happens if a breach happens with, can't read that word, with with files and data? I'm going to assume we're talking about therapy data. First of all, that would be bad. And I'm going to be honest. Depending on the type of breach, there are some legal ramifications of what you have to do. I've been in like several breaches. I think in the other recording, I talked about probably the worst, other than Equifax or Experian, one of those e-credit things. The worst was when Blue Cross Blue Shield, the provider network data, was hacked, which basically meant that they got all of my employment data. So it was my social security number, home address, all that sort of stuff. They have to notify you. And usually with that sort of a breach, where it's that type of information, the company has to take steps to protect your credit. And so they do things like they have to pay for free credit monitoring and a bunch of other stuff that never seems like quite enough, actually. So if you're talking, though, about if somehow research data is breached, like SurveyMonkey, well, it's just a bunch of numbers. That's why we should never have identifying information in that database, if at all possible. Because, SurveyMonkey is secure, but I don't trust that stuff. And so for a data breach, effectively it's just numbers, as long as you don't have any identifying information in your data set. One thing, though, that you guys should be careful about with SurveyMonkey and other online data collection things is that quite often there's a default for it to collect your IP address, and there is some debate about whether that would also be potentially identifying. So maybe don't turn that on, because I can't think of a good reason to have that, or set it to not collect. At your practice, information about billing is kept separate from private patient notes. So, billing information is mostly going to be tracking payments and who your insurance company is and that sort of thing. A lot of that stuff is online, or like it's an online interface, so you can't really you can't just digitize it. Like, you actually have to submit the bill online. However, typically when you're submitting it to, like when I submit a bill to Blue Cross, I'm using their portal, which is supposed to meet certain standards of information and encryption. And so therefore it would be a breach of them if they got that information. In my files, it might be, there's billing software. And sometimes it's actually billing software that'll generate bills, but usually it's more like an internal accounting system. And same thing, it'll have the patient's name, it might have a diagnostic code, it has a record of maybe who the insurance is, and what their balance is. That sort of thing, when you're purchasing it, you need to basically get a secure system. Everything should be encrypted. There should be like two-factor authentication, firewalls, and all that sort of stuff. So don't wing it and put it on an Excel sheet. Basically, it should be part of one of those systems that's very secure. And again, at that point, they're probably going to hack like the online backup rather than your computer at your office. They tend to go for big targets. After that, one of the things I mentioned in the other the recording I did last night is that if you are going, your records in your office are on paper. It's a file like I bring to class, except it's got personal information in it. Also, in the other one, I talked about like progress notes versus therapy notes versus all that stuff that made my head kind of hurt. Basically, keep in mind that that's usually a physical paper record. And in the old days, the general rule is you're supposed to keep it for 7 days. Said that in the or 7 days, 7 years. Said that in the other one from termination. And then afterwards, like so, people would have storage facilities basically, which was a little dicey. Typically, what you'd want is a facility big enough where you could store those records in the attic, for example. Seems like a really big fire hazard, but and then every 7 years you shred them. You can hire secure services to do that, to do the shredding. Most of the offices, that was what like the receptionist or the night staff would do, or like the evening staff. It was usually a student who would be there just for the few patients who came in at late or later at night. Not late. We never stayed open terribly, but you want somebody there, and so they would do things like the shredding at that point. A lot of people these days, though, to save on that, and I mentioned this in the other thing, is that what we do is they scan the records and keep them on a computer, so that way you have digital storage. My best recommendation is that you just don't connect that computer to the internet. And then basically what you have at that point is a break-in rather than being hacked. And even then, on your computer that shouldn't be connected to the internet, you want that information encrypted and password protected. So you basically have to take all the steps you can to try to keep it safe. At the end of the day, if somebody wants something, they can get it for the most part. And so if you have that kind of data breach, then at that point, I would absolutely consult a lawyer as well as the state board just to make sure you're following all the relevant rules. But for the most part, I imagine you would have to notify the patients whose records were accessed and let them know what has happened. The only upside to that, guys, is I don't know that I've ever heard of that happening. Usually what they're going to go for is the system that would have social security numbers and that type of information, and we don't keep patient social security numbers. So they go for places like Equifax, the Blue Cross. They still, steal credit cards. Got caught in a Target one because they basically somehow got a hold of all of Target's credit card transactions over the course of like 6 weeks before they realized it. So they had my credit card number and that sort of thing. And always the company notifies me. They have to tell you the extent of the breach and what steps they're taking to correct it. So also, this isn't a standard 4, but it was a good question from Elena. What would need to be present in order to report, or what signs would need to be present in order to report suspicions of elder abuse? Any sign of elder abuse. There's not like it has to be, so you have to be paying attention. And elder abuse or any form of abuse can have a number of different presentations. And so, bruises certainly are one. Doctors are always on the alert for like a high number of visits, like, tripping a lot, broken bones. And this is dicey because older people tend to lose weight for a lot of reasons, but someone who's lost a lot of weight, they look very frail, but you have to see a sign that someone is, for example, withholding medication, or they're physically abusing them, or you discover, for example, that they have access to grandma's financial records and they're spending all the money. That's financial abuse. And I think any of those you would want to contact the necessary authorities. So it doesn't have to be like, this big of a bruise, or it is, this person's vulnerable and it appears that someone is either physically, emotionally, financially, their health care, they are doing something that is harmful. So it's another one of those, there's not like a exact answer because there's so many different situations that can happen. So for standard 4, So how would you discuss a client with your spouse? I don't. Um, okay, that's not fair because I do vent. So I would discuss a client with my spouse. First of all, I try not to do that because it's dangerous and you can get sort of a slippery slope. So usually it's kind of like how I would talk about a student, right? Oh my God, you never believe what this person did today. They asked this question and that sort of thing. So if I do, it's more of that, oh my God, it was such a hard day. I had someone that was just, they had a horrific family background and oh, it was so bad. And I need a drink. And that's it. You can't give identifying details. You can't do anything that that might identify the person. And you have to minimize the risk that you're going to break their confidentiality. Now, that being said, when my patients call, their name pops up on my phone. So it doesn't take a lot, especially with someone that, like the person I call Karma, my husband's seen her first name. And so like when you store contacts and things like that, you don't want to put their last name. You want to kind of like, to initials, anything like that to protect their identity so they don't know who it is. I will admit that there's been at least once or twice where I slipped with a first name, but that was it. And luckily there's a whole bunch of Jennifers out there. So, you're human. You're going to want to vent. You vent to your colleagues. You vent to, at some point you're going to go home and tell your spouse you had a bad day or your partner. You cannot give identifying details. So I think that was the question. I hope I understood that one. How do we keep notes organized without including client names? Oh no, the names are on that record. There's names. So in fact, at the top, I don't know if I posted it for you guys. Division 12 used to have like a model case note, basically, or progress note. And they're not on their website anymore, but I still have the PDF, so I do it. And basically, sorry, that's my husband. And at the very top, it has to have their name. So you do not redact names in a progress note in client records. It's kind of like a medical chart. Your name is in there. There's identifying information in the front usually because there's a demographic sheet that you do for patients. You have their home address, their contact, but it's all physical paper in a file in your office. So, so that's how we have their names. All right, so Claudia, standard 4. All right, so what happens if psychologists accidentally reveal a client names? Well, it depends on who you reveal it to. I will tell you that I've had to have a lot of conversations with my husband about the fact that this work I do is very confidential and it's not something we can just sort of sit down and shoot the shit about. If I accidentally drop a name, he knows the degree with which that has to be protected. That being said, it's still not a good idea because, he could, after all these years, turn out to be a secret asshole and decide to, have revenge, and you get the idea. So, usually the people you're going to be talking to your patients about know the rules and understand. But it's also why it's just dangerous to give and talk about it a whole lot with the people in your private life, because that's going to get you in trouble. So, how do psychologists discuss confidentiality with people with intellectual disabilities? You do it in a language that they will understand. Yeah. And I'm trying to think of, if you're working with, I actually talked to Dr. LeBlanc about like the question I think Taylor had about if a child doesn't give assent, and her was kind of like, at some point, like a 2 or 3 year old, they're not really going to be able to. I still think it's a good idea to you present it in language they understand. And that would mean things like, we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. And so I need you to understand that, if it's an adult and they have that right, that your information is very private and I can't tell anybody without your permission. There's only a couple of times that I have to do that. And for example, if I think that you're in danger or I think you're going to hurt somebody else And I usually kind of do that whole, like, I mean, that would be horrible. Like, nobody wants to hurt other people. And so if I thought that was going to happen, then I would have to do stuff to keep you and that other person safe. So you reach their level and try to make sure they understand. If it's someone with a severe intellectual disability, there's probably going to be a guardian who's actually signing all the forms. So think of it as like with a child, you get consent from the guardian or the person who has the power of attorney. You get assent from the person that you're working with. All right, Bobby, standard 4. So probably shouldn't be identifying who's asking these questions. I apologize. When a client presents a risk to themselves and others, what is the protocol with confidentiality? If they're an imminent risk, you have to take steps to keep them safe, and that includes a lot of different things. You could, for example, hospitalize them, which means you wouldn't necessarily have to, or you start with trying to convince them to go to the hospital. If they do that voluntarily, you don't have to break confidentiality. You only have to break confidentiality if they are refusing to go, in which case you might have to, well, I can, you guys can't, you have to, but I could, under certain circumstances, because there's a lot of rules about it, I could issue a physician's emergency certificate, I could contact the authorities, call 911, and basically, but you try to convince the person to go voluntarily so they can sign themselves in. There is a form that you do with the physician's emergency certificate. You can actually get it through the DHS, or it's the State Department of Health and Human Hospitals website. I think the LSBEP website also has one, and there's different steps you have to take to do that. There's rules, like I have to have seen the person within 48 hours. So if I've gone a couple of weeks between sessions, I can't issue a PEC, then I have to call 911. You can call the coroner's office, which sounds horrible, but in the state of Louisiana, coroners have the ability to do a physician's emergency certificate, and they also get called into hospital settings to be that third person who evaluates to determine whether the person has to be kept. And so social counselors, social workers, last time I checked, don't have the ability to do a PEC, and so they end up having to call the coroner's office to issue one for one of their patients. I can call their family if I think that's a better way to get them to go to the hospital. And if they're threatening someone else and it's an imminent threat, then I can call the police, call them, and warn them. Hopefully we're going to have a little bit more time to talk about crisis at the end. That's sort of why I'm doing things this way. So I'll try to give you guys some more information about all that at that juncture. And I think I answered the question about how do you make sure that patients understand. You explain it in language they get, right? So think about how you would talk to a child. And that sounds stupid, but I'm trying to think most extreme would be if I'm trying to explain this to a 2-year-old, right? And so with a 2-year-old, I would do a lot of stuff like, and probably I would be on the ground playing Candyland because that's a good way to establish rapport. I'm also hoping I would never have to PEC a 2-year-old. But I might ask, like, do you understand what a secret is? And that sounds really bad, like I'm about to set them up to, like, keep secrets. But, like, we're going to end up talking about some things while you're here. And one of the things I want you to make sure you're okay with is that if I occasionally talk to your mom and dad, if there's something that they need to know. And are you okay with me talking to your mom and dad? That sort of thing. In general, with kids, all bets are off. If they're an imminent risk, you have to go to their parents for that sort of thing. So it kind of then goes back to the person with the intellectual disability. You have to have some understanding of what they can comprehend and try to figure out how to frame it in a way that they will understand it. All right, so what are the general rules, beliefs about psychologist self-disclosure, specifically as it pertains to working in clinical therapeutic setting? I mentioned this in class. So some therapeutic approaches are okay with you using like analogies, but you cannot cross that line into you're using the session for your own therapeutic benefits. So I would talk to patients about the fact that I, for most of my life, felt like the Jolly Green Giant because I was almost this tall when I was 13 and, well, not much smaller actually. And so the coaches in the high school used to joke about me being on the JV football team, which I actually would have enjoyed, but that wasn't happening in the 70s and 80s. So I would share that whole, like, I don't understand your body image concerns, but as a woman, I understand those pressures. Does that follow? As a woman, I understand how frustrating it is when you look in the mirror and suddenly you see your mother instead of you and things like that. I tell my patients, for example, that I use thought monitoring and relaxation all the time. I think that those sorts of things, what you're doing is both establishing rapport, conveying that you're trying to understand, but typically it's I practice what I preach and what I'm teaching you guys. And I'm teaching you relaxation, not just because it was the skill in a book that I read one time, it's because I actually use it when I'm feeling anxious and when I'm overwhelmed, and it works. And so it's not just what the research says, this is what I do. And so that can be kind of a powerful thing in therapy. And so you can use it like when you're making an example. I can talk about the fact that I still have days where I feel really, really stupid. And I'm not really sure how I ever got my degrees, much less, managed to get out of bed every morning, much less get my degrees. So sharing that with someone can kind of reassure them that some of these things they're feeling and experiencing, everybody experiences. They're not as separate and different as they feel, but be careful, because I've also gotten in trouble when I looked at a client and said, well, I know how you feel, and they lost it a little bit because they were right. I don't know how they feel, and you should never assume that what you went through is the same thing they're going through. So use it as an example, but you can't be doing your own therapy. Unless the different therapeutic approaches have different rules about it. Like psychoanalysis, you're supposed to be a blank slate, so know anything that from your personal world and life. Reportable disclosure is made during the interview process for research data collection. All right, this is a good one and a little tricky. What happens if a reportable disclosure is made during an interview process for research data collection or survey, but that disclosure wasn't anticipated and you did or didn't discuss the limits of confidentiality prior to the disclosure? So in research, if you're doing that kind of interview, there's going to be some consent and disclosure of how the information is going to be used. So after that, though, it depends on whether it's an anonymous survey or it's an in-person survey. Realistically, though, if you are doing part of it and it's actually like a diagnostic interview, then there should be things in the consent form that offers guidance in terms of what is going to happen with that information and how it would be used. Now, let's say I'm not doing anything overly sensitive and suddenly my research participant that I'm about to have do some sort of Stroop test or something like that turns to me and says, I'm suicidal. We can't ignore it. They're not my patient, though. And so they're not a patient, and therefore I can't PEC them. It becomes more of a, how do I get this person the help they need and get them to people who can do all of that other stuff, like do the evaluation and all of that sort of stuff. At the end of the day, I would have to basically, depending on the setting though, if it were like here, then the next step would be to do a LinkedIn report, call campus police and explain to them this is what happened. Hopefully though, I would walk them over to the counseling center because you can do a walk-in crisis thing. And that's what I train my research folks to do. If someone gets really freaked out, you walk them to the counseling. Don't just send them, you walk them to the counseling center yourself and turn them over. So you can't ignore it, but if you are going to be asking those sorts of, if you know you're going to be asking sensitive questions, then you need to think through before, when you're designing the study, what are you going to do with this disclosure? And that should probably be in the consent form somewhere. So, so I guess plan it well. You guys kind of went all over the place with this one. I'm sorry, it's like y'all went in reverse order, or they're all mixed up sometimes. Is explaining the limits of confidentiality for our own protection. Yes, and theirs. You know, patients have to know what they're getting into. It is a CYA for you, but also it is unfair for someone not to know the ground rules in terms of how you're going to react and what you're going to do. And so it offers legal protection for us, absolutely. But again, patients need to know what to expect, because otherwise they're not going to have any trust. You know, it is within their right to not tell you something, even something like that. So, it is for our protection. What if a client forgets the limits and later regrets it? Well, you did your job and you have it documented. And so if they forget, well, there might be other issues, because people don't tend to forget that. If there is that chance, though, like if I think a patient's about to go somewhere that I'm really concerned that I might have to wade into that, I usually pause and remind them. Like, look, I just want to remind you those limits of confidentiality, because, you know, you need to understand that depending on what you say next is going to, you know, we're going to have a conversation and me figure out what exactly we need to do about all this. So it's okay to pause them. You can remind them. And they usually don't forget. Is the risk of keeping records worth it if it means providing better care? Oh, recordings. Yeah. If there is, for some reason, that you think you need to keep those recordings, like I could imagine maybe in like someone who's working with a patient with dementia, recordings might be helpful, but there wouldn't be necessarily recordings of the whole session. There are reasons why we might use recordings in the therapeutic process. Like, for example, when I was doing systematic desensitization with a patient with social phobia, we actually started with recording me giving a speech so she could see how nervous I got, and recording her. And then basically I had talked to her about we destroyed them immediately after. There was no reason to keep that. There might be a protocol, though, in which that became important. Some patients you do, well, this isn't the same thing either, but like, you know, recordings for relaxation or an exposure script. But that's not the medical record or the progress note. That would actually probably be more part of your therapy notes, which you don't have to hand over if you guys listen to that lecture. But I would again say you got to think through why you're doing this and what are the potential consequences, and then take steps to keep the information safe. Is it allowed for a client to record a session to review later? Louisiana's a one consent state, and really the rules are all written about how I interact with the patient and not vice versa. And so I'm pretty sure at least 1 or 2 or 12 patients of mine have recorded me, in much the same way I've recorded doctors before, and to make sure I like, you know, especially if it was when my sister had an aneurysm, I recorded the conversation when he was giving us feedback, because I knew I was emotional. And I was afraid my memory would not be 100% accurate. Not that it ever is, but, you know, Louisiana is a one consent state. And so they can absolutely have that recorder going. You can't, though, in that setting. So I'm saying keep that in mind. I'm not to make everybody paranoid. Like, you know, you should always be mindful of, and not the mindfulness, but you should be aware of and mindful of what you're doing. You know, in the classroom these days, I have to be particularly careful, because any student out there could be recording for very good reasons, but also for not good reasons. But even if they weren't, I should not, if there's something that is said that I'm embarrassed is on an audio recording, then I probably shouldn't have said it to begin with. So the same thing in therapy, and in therapy especially, because those things we say, the things we do, also can greatly impact the well-being of that person sitting across from us. So always be on your best behavior. But, I don't know what I would do if a client asked. If they asked, then I would sort of sit down and explain to them that it made me uncomfortable and why. And then I would be very concerned about if that fell into the wrong hands or if someone else had it, that at that point it's a major breach. But again, it's their record. So, but if they asked, I have the right to say no, thank you. I'd prefer if you didn't. And what they do from there, I don't have a lot of control over. If a student discloses they are abusing substances to a school psychologist, should they report this to the parent, school, or law? Some of them, none of them. That's where you have to figure out what the laws are for your state. And there would be specific reporting laws that are related to things like in the school. And again, this is one of those that, this is why I work with adults or 16 and over, but there is likely a state law that mandates what you're supposed to do if that is reported. Now, the flip side is you also need to very much be aware of the consequences of potentially reporting that, because you know how much hell can break loose. So I don't know the answer to that. I will ask, but it's also one of those things that I think it is good. I'm going to go back to that boilerplate, which is always know the state laws, because that's what's going to dictate that. It's not in the ethical code, it's state law. So now I'm going to go down a rabbit hole after we finish with this. Okay, it's going too long. All right, so try to quickly. How do you address the issue of confidentiality, children and their parents? I think I've answered that. How confidential are children's charts when it comes to the parents? Technically, the parent has access. And again, the information, not the paper. But I think it's very important, like what I retained from all those classes on child psychology and talking to people, it is important for the child to feel secure to be able to talk to you, or that you're not going to do what you need to do in therapy. Most of the folks I've worked with understood that. And they, again, I work with older kids though. If there was something that was vital or the parent wanted to do that, then I ask that we do it as a family session rather than it feeling like you were going behind the kid's back. So, but at the end of the day, the parents have access to that information. Digital records and recordings would be kept in a secure location, much in the same place we keep basically the paper records. They're supposed to be in a locked room or secure room that is to be locked, not in a common area. And you always want to have a security system at your practice. And typically it's a good idea to have a separate key for the room, although a lot of people don't do it. But the idea is you have to keep it in a secure location so that not everybody can have access. But you would keep them in store them the same way you store just the physical paper records. So, all right. So this one's about a book. If I was going to write a book, can I write about my patients? Well, I mean, Freud did. There are a number of examples of books where that happened, including one of my all-time favorites is Oliver Sacks, I think his name. There was a Robin Williams movie about him. He's a neurologist, basically. Yeah, I think that's. But it's the book is called "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat," and it was about what happens with different forms of brain injury and how that can present and the things it does. He used case examples, but withheld names. But also, if it's real specific, there's not a lot of people out there like that. And so you have to always, you can, but you have to take steps to protect their identity, and that might include tweaking some details. So those of you who have me for abnormal, you know, the pink and green lady, well, it wasn't really pink and green. It was completely different colors, and I'm not going to tell you what. You know, I never identified the town. But, I mean, it was out in BFE, but not like, I mean, Louisiana's got a lot of BFE. So you can do it, but you have to take care. Also, if you're going to do that, you should probably, it would never be a bad idea to get the patient's consent. You know, if you know that you're going to be writing a book and you're going to, you know, and you're going to, because you have a particular patient in mind, it would probably be a good idea to have a conversation and get their consent just to CYA. Technically we can, but be careful because sometimes what you don't think are identifying details might actually identify the person. All right. That's it. Sorry, I got confused. I know y'all are surprised by that. And we talked about that. So this is, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it was basically when, if the child does not consent because they don't understand the need for therapy, ultimately the parents have control over that. The parents will decide if the child's going to stay in therapy. And that, again, though, goes back to when your job is to figure out how to build some rapport and identify some things that the person might want to work on. I answered that one. I'm not sure, is there any way to trump asking for their consent, i.e. in an emergency, or do you just take notes? I explain in the first session that I have to keep a record. They don't actually have to give me consent for me to keep the record. I'm mandated by law to keep the record. And so, you know, if your doctor doesn't ask you, it's okay with you if you keep a medical chart, it's kind of the same thing. And so I just explained that I'm going to be keeping the records. You only have to get special consent if you're doing recording. All right, this went long, so I'm going to stop. And yeah, I got to do another one in a second on 5 and 6. I'm looking forward to that. I'll see you all in a minute.